Number 1. Skylar Neese. The girl her best friends erased. Skylar Annette Neese was born on February 10, 1996, in Star City, West Virginia, a quiet suburban community just outside of Morgantown, and from the very beginning she was described by everyone who knew her as a girl who carried warmth, intelligence, and a kind of loyalty that made the people around her feel genuinely seen and valued. She was the only child of Dave and Mary Neese, a close and devoted family who placed enormous importance on being present in each other's lives. And Skylar grew up in a household where she was consistently loved and deeply encouraged to pursue whatever future she imagined for herself. Her father Dave described her as bubbly and genuine, someone who lit up a room without trying, and her mother Mary returned again and again in later interviews to the same image of a daughter who was funny, caring, and fiercely devoted to the people she called her own. Skylar met her best friend Shalia Eddy when the two of them were just 8 years old, and that early childhood bond deepened over the following years into what appeared to everyone around them to be an inseparable closeness. The kind of friendship built on years of shared secrets, late nights, and the comfortable shorthand that develops between two people who have grown up alongside each other. When Rachel Schoaf entered their social circle during their freshman year of high school, the three girls formed what looked from the outside like a perfectly ordinary teenage trio, navigating the familiar landscape of school, social media, part-time jobs, and weekend plans with the easy confidence of young people who had each other's backs. Skylar was, by every visible measure, thriving. She maintained a 4.0 grade point average, she worked part-time at a local Wendy's restaurant, and her social media presence reflected the same cheerful, outgoing personality that her parents and teachers had always known. Nothing in the record of her daily life suggested that anything was seriously wrong beneath the surface, and that absence of visible warning signs was part of what made the events of July 2012 so difficult for the people who loved her to absorb and understand. On the night of July 5, 2012, Skylar returned home from her shift at work and settled in for what seemed like an unremarkable evening. Sometime after midnight, she slipped quietly out of her parents' apartment through her bedroom window, a detail that surveillance footage from the building would later confirm, and she got into a car where Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf were waiting. It was not unusual for the three girls to venture out together late at night, and to Skylar it almost certainly felt like nothing more than the kind of harmless spontaneity that teenagers embrace when they want to feel free and alive. She had no reason to suspect that anything was different about this particular night. She trusted the two people in that car more than almost anyone else in her world, and it was precisely that trust, that deep and unquestioned certainty that she was safe with them, that left her entirely without protection against what they had already decided to do. Eddy drove the car to a remote rural road in Wayne Township, Greene County, Pennsylvania, far from Star City and far from anyone who might witness what was about to happen. And it was there, in an isolated stretch of darkness, that Skylar Neese's life came to an end at the hands of the two people she believed were her closest friends. She was 16 years old. Her body was concealed beneath branches and overgrowth, and left in that hidden place while Eddy and Schoaf drove back home, returning to their ordinary lives as though nothing had occurred. When Skylar did not come home the following morning, her parents immediately reported her missing, and the investigation that followed was initially classified as a possible runaway situation, a determination that significantly delayed the urgency of the response and that frustrated Dave and Mary Neese deeply. The surveillance footage showing Skylar willingly climbing out of her window and entering a car led law enforcement to conclude, at least initially, that she had left of her own accord, and an Amber Alert that had been issued was eventually canceled on that basis, a decision that would later prompt the state of West Virginia to revise its missing child notification protocols entirely. While investigators searched for leads that consistently led nowhere, Shalia Eddy and Rachel Schoaf presented themselves to the world as grieving, frightened friends. They appeared at the Neese family home to offer comfort. They participated in community searches. They spoke to investigators with what appeared to be genuine distress, and they maintained an active social media presence in which they expressed worry, love, and longing for their missing friend, with Eddy posting messages of endearment about Skylar in the weeks and months that followed that were so convincing in their apparent sincerity that even people close to the case had no immediate reason to question them. The performance of grief that both girls sustained across the summer and into the fall of 2012 was remarkable in its consistency and its detail, and it held the community's suspicion at bay for far longer than might otherwise have been the case. The break came in late December 2012, when Rachel Schoaf, who had been visibly struggling with anxiety and emotional instability throughout the preceding months, experienced a mental health crisis on December 28 and was admitted to a psychiatric facility. Separated from Shalia Eddie for the first time since the crime and surrounded by medical professionals in an environment where the pressure of maintaining the deception was suddenly lifted, Shof began to come apart under the weight of what she was carrying. On January 3, 2013, she asked to speak with investigators and confessed in full that she and Eddie had planned and executed the murder of Skylar Neese. She agreed to lead authorities to the location where Skylar's remains had been left, and in January 2013, nearly 7 months after Skylar had climbed out of her bedroom window for the last time, her body was recovered in the wooded area of Wayne Township, exactly where Shof had indicated it would be. Forensic examination of Eddie's vehicle later confirmed the presence of Skylar's DNA inside the car, providing the physical corroboration that prosecutors needed to move forward with charges against both girls. Shalia Eddie was taken into custody shortly after, and a case that had haunted an entire community for months finally began to reveal its terrible truth. When investigators asked Rachel Shof directly why she and Eddie had done what they did, her answer was so stripped of emotion and context that it became one of the most widely repeated and deeply unsettling statements of the entire case. State Police Corporal Ronnie Gaskins later told reporters that when he asked Shof why they killed Skylar, her only response was that they simply did not like her anymore. Later court proceedings and media reporting, including a Hulu documentary released in March 2026, would add a further layer of context to that explanation, with Shof indicating that she and Eddie had developed a secret romantic relationship that they were desperate to keep hidden, and that they feared Skylar, who was perceptive and socially aware, might expose that relationship or otherwise become a complication in their lives. Whether jealousy, fear of exposure, or a simpler and darker form of social cruelty drove the decision, the fact remained that 2 teenage girls had sat in a science class and planned the deliberate ending of their closest friend's life, had carried out that plan with a degree of coordination and composure that investigators described as deeply troubling, and had then returned to their daily routines and maintained the lie for more than 6 months with a consistency that belied their age. Rachel Shof pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on May 1, 2013, and was sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years by the Monongalia County Circuit Court. Shalia Eddie pleaded guilty to first-degree murder on January 24, 2014, and received a sentence of life in prison with eligibility for parole after 15 years. Both were tried as adults and both were sent to the Lakin Correctional Center in West Virginia, where they remain. According to West Virginia Division of Corrections records, Shof's projected release date is April 30, 2028, and Eddie becomes eligible for a parole hearing beginning in May of the same year. The murder of Skylar Neese left a mark on the state of West Virginia that extended well beyond the grief of one family. Her case directly prompted changes to the state's Amber Alert system, ensuring that future missing child notifications would not be canceled simply because footage existed of a child appearing to leave voluntarily. Dave and Mary Neese have continued to speak publicly about their daughter in the years since, keeping her memory present in a world that might otherwise have moved on, insisting again and again that Skylar was more than the manner of her death, that she was a girl with a future she deserved to live, and that the friendship she extended to the 2 people who took that future from her was one of the most genuine things about her. Skylar Neese was 16 years old when she was let down by the people she trusted most, and the case that bears her name remains one of the most discussed and most devastating examples of betrayal within teenage friendship that the American true crime landscape has ever recorded. Number 2, Shanda Sharer. 12 years old and taken by those she knew, Shanda Renee Sharer was born on June 6, 1979, in Pineville, Kentucky, and spent her early childhood moving between family arrangements that shifted after her parents divorced, eventually settling with her mother Jacqueline in Louisville before circumstances brought her to the town of Jeffersonville, Indiana, where she enrolled in a new school and began building the social connections that a bright and friendly 12-year-old naturally seeks out. By the fall of 1991, Shanda had found what she believed was a genuine friendship in a classmate named Amanda Heverin, and the 2 girls developed a close bond that, for Shanda, represented the kind of belonging that every child entering a new school hopes to find. What Shanda did not fully understand, and what would ultimately cost her everything, was that Amanda was also connected to a 16-year-old girl named Melinda Lovelace who attended a different school and who regarded Amanda as her own romantic partner. Melinda Loveless had grown up in New Albany, Indiana, in circumstances that those who later studied her case described as deeply troubled, shaped by a home environment marked by instability and by experiences that left significant psychological marks on a girl who was, even by the standards of her peer group, regarded as volatile and aggressive. When Loveless discovered that Amanda Heavrin had developed a close relationship with 12-year-old Shanda Sharer, her response was not confusion or sadness but something far darker. And she began sending Shanda threatening messages that escalated in their intensity and specificity over the weeks that followed. The threats became serious enough that Shanda's mother transferred her to a new school in an attempt to create physical distance between her daughter and the source of the danger. But the transfer, as events would prove, was not enough to protect her. On the evening of January 10, 1992, Melinda Loveless reached out to her friend Lori Tackett, a 17-year-old from Madison, Indiana, and the two of them devised a plan that began that night with a drive to Shanda's father's house in Jeffersonville. Tackett brought along two girls she knew, 15-year-olds Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence, who had never met Loveless or Shanda but who went along with what was initially described to them as a plan to frighten and confront the younger girl. Shanda was staying at her father's home that weekend, and when the girls arrived and knocked on the door, she slipped out of the house to meet them, having been told she was being taken to see Amanda Heavrin. She got into the car without resistance, trusting that the visit was exactly what it appeared to be, completely unaware that Melinda Loveless was hidden beneath a blanket in the back seat. What followed over the next several hours was a progression of events that took Shanda from one location to another across the Indiana darkness. As the four older girls subjected her to a sustained ordeal that began with Loveless confronting her aggressively about her relationship with Amanda and escalated through the night in ways that grew increasingly severe. Shanda was taken to an abandoned property, then to Lori Tackett's residence in Madison, where the situation deteriorated further, and then to a remote rural location outside the city where the final act of the night took place. At approximately noon on January 11, 1992, two bird watchers named Don and Ralph Foley discovered a body in a field along a rural road in Jefferson County, Indiana. The physical evidence at the scene confirmed that Shanda had been alive when the fire was set, a detail that medical examiners established through the condition of her remains, including the position of her arms which had drawn upward in a reaction consistent with extreme heat exposure. She was 12 years old. The body was identified as Shanda Sharer, and the investigation that followed moved with unusual speed because information about what had happened began to reach law enforcement almost immediately. A 15-year-old boy in Madison told authorities that he had overheard a group of girls discussing the killing, and within a short time Toni Lawrence and her parents came voluntarily to the Madison police station, where Toni provided a detailed account of what had taken place the night before. Her cooperation led investigators directly to the other three participants, and all four girls were taken into custody within days of the crime. The case generated immediate and intense national attention, in part because of the ages of those involved and in part because of the sheer brutality of what four teenage girls had done to a 12-year-old child who had done nothing to any of them except exist in a relationship that one of them resented. All four were tried as adults in Indiana courts, a decision that reflected the gravity of the offense and the deliberate nature of the planning involved. Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett each pleaded guilty and received sentences of 60 years in prison. Hope Rippey received a sentence of 35 years, and Toni Lawrence, whose role was considered less direct, received 20 years. All four have since been released. Loveless was released in 2019 after serving 26 years. Tackett was released after 25 years. Rippey was paroled after 14 years and Lawrence after 9. The release of each of them, particularly Loveless, generated significant public reaction from people who felt that the sentences did not adequately reflect the severity of what had been done to a child who was 12 years old and who had walked out of her father's house that night believing she was going to see a friend. Shanda's mother Jacqueline and the broader Sharer family have continued to be vocal about the impact of her death in the decades since, and the case has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television segments that have examined both the crime itself and the social and psychological circumstances that produced it. The murder of Shanda Sharer remains one of the most widely studied cases of juvenile violence in American criminal history, not only because of the circumstances and the ages of everyone involved, but because it raised deeply uncomfortable questions about the conditions under which adolescents become capable of extreme harm and about the social environments, the peer dynamics, the unchecked jealousies, the absence of adult intervention that can allow a plan like the one Melinda Loveless set in motion to move from an angry thought to a completed act without anyone stopping it. Shanda Sharer deserved the life that was taken from her on January 11, 1992, and the case that carries her name continues to serve as a sobering reminder of the particular vulnerability of children who find themselves, through no fault of their own, at the center of other people's conflicts. Number 3. Cassie Jo Stoddart, the friend they chose as their target. Cassie Jo Stoddart was born on December 21, 1989, and grew up in Pocatello, Idaho, a mid-sized city in the southeastern part of the state that was, by most measures, the kind of place where the concerns of daily life felt manageable and where serious violent crime was uncommon enough that the community had little reason to imagine it could arrive suddenly and without warning in the form of the people they already knew. Cassie was 16 years old in the fall of 2006, a junior at Pocatello High School who was described by her family and peers as popular, kind, and socially confident in the easy way of someone who had grown up in the same community and built genuine connections there over many years. She had a boyfriend named Matt Beckham and a circle of friends that included 2 boys named Brian Lee Draper and Tori Michael Adamczyk, both of whom were also 16 and both of whom attended the same high school and moved in overlapping social circles with Cassie and her friends. To anyone watching from the outside, Draper and Adamczyk appeared to be typical teenage boys, enrolled in school, socially connected, present in the ordinary texture of adolescent life in Pocatello. What no one around them knew was that the 2 of them had been privately nursing an obsession that had been growing for months, shaped in large part by their fixation on the 1996 horror film Scream and by a shared fantasy of becoming, as they described it in private recordings they made of themselves, legendary killers whose names would be remembered and feared. They had decided they wanted to commit a murder. They had discussed it between themselves in conversations they filmed, producing footage of 2 teenage boys speaking with chilling casualness about the act of taking a life and about the notoriety they believed would follow. They had decided that they needed a victim, and the victim they chose was Cassie Jo Stoddart, their friend and classmate, a girl who had no idea that her name had been selected for this purpose and who continued to interact with both of them in the ordinary way of someone who regarded them as people she simply knew from school. In September 2006, Cassie was asked to house sit for her aunt and uncle, Allison and Frank Contreras, at their home on Whispering Cliffs Drive in northeast Bannock County, while the family was away on a trip. On the evening of September 22, 2006, Matt Beckham came to keep her company, and Draper and Adamczyk also arrived at the house, ostensibly to spend time with the group. During that visit, the 2 boys moved through the house undetected and unlocked a basement door, creating a point of re-entry for later that night. They then left with Beckham when he departed, and Cassie was alone in the house. What happened in the hours that followed, based on the evidence that investigators would later gather and on the recordings that Draper and Adamczyk made of themselves, was that the 2 boys returned to the Contreras home through the unlocked basement entrance and made their way through the darkened house to where Cassie was. She was found 2 days later, on September 24, 2006, when the Contreras family returned from their trip. A frantic 911 call placed by a woman at the scene described finding a girl on the floor. Cassie Jo Stoddart had been stabbed approximately 30 times. She was 16 years old. The investigation that followed moved quickly to focus on the last people known to have been with Cassie, and detectives interviewed Draper and Adamczyk within days of the discovery. Both boys provided accounts of their movements that night that included claims of watching a movie, though neither could recall basic details about the film they claimed to have seen, and investigators found the inconsistencies in their stories notable from the beginning. The break in the case came when law enforcement discovered a videotape that Draper and Adamczyk had buried near the scene. A recording in which the 2 boys had filmed themselves before and after entering the house, speaking openly about what they were planning to do and, in footage recorded after Cassie's death, describing what they had done with a degree of excitement and self-congratulation that left the investigators who viewed it deeply shaken. The tape contained explicit discussions of the murder plan, references to their admiration for the killers depicted in the Scream franchise, and statements that removed any ambiguity about premeditation or intent. Both boys were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. They were tried as adults in separate proceedings. Brian Draper was convicted on April 17, 2007, and Tori Adamczyk was convicted on June 8, 2007. 6th District Judge Peter D. McDermott sentenced both of them to a fixed life term in prison for the first-degree murder charge and 30 years fixed with life indeterminate for the conspiracy charge. In handing down the sentences, Judge McDermott stated plainly that he was convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that if either of the two were ever released, they would kill again. Multiple appeals filed by both Draper and Adamczyk in the years that followed were denied at every level, including by the Idaho Supreme Court, which in December 2017 upheld Adamczyk's conviction and sentence, and by a United States District Court in 2019, which rejected Adamczyk's further petition for relief. Both men, now in their mid-30s, remain incarcerated at the Idaho State Correctional Institution. The family of Cassie Jo Stoddart subsequently filed a lawsuit against the Pocatello School District, a legal action that reflected the broader community reckoning with the question of how two students had managed to develop and act upon such a plan without any adult in their school or social environment detecting warning signs. Cassie's mother, Anna Stoddart, appeared in court proceedings and in subsequent media coverage to speak about her daughter, consistently drawing attention back to the person Cassie was rather than the manner in which she died. A 16-year-old with a full and promising life ahead of her, whose only mistake was trusting people she had every reason to believe were simply her friends. Number 4. Payton Leutner, betrayed by a fantasy her friends believed was real. Payton Leutner was 12 years old in the spring of 2014, a sixth-grade student living in Waukesha, Wisconsin, a suburban community in the Milwaukee metropolitan area, and by all accounts she was an ordinary, cheerful girl in the midst of the particular social intensity of early adolescence, navigating friendships and school, and the beginning of the phase of life where the people you spend your time with start to feel like the most important thing in your world. Two of the friends she spent time with were Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier, also 12, and the three girls had developed the kind of close, overlapping friendship that is common among girls of that age, built around sleepovers and shared interests and the comfortable familiarity of spending significant amounts of time together. What Payton did not know, and what no adult in her life knew either, was that Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier had developed a private shared belief system centered on a fictional internet horror character known as Slender Man. A tall, featureless figure that had originated as a piece of internet-created fiction, but that both girls had come to regard as a genuine supernatural entity with real power and real demands. Geyser in particular had been experiencing significant psychological difficulties that were not yet recognized or diagnosed, and her belief in the reality of Slender Man was not a performance or a game but a genuine feature of her perception of the world. The two girls had convinced themselves that Slender Man required proof of their devotion and loyalty, and that by harming someone close to them and offering that act as a demonstration of their commitment, they would become his servants and proxies and would be protected from harm. The person they identified for this purpose was Payton Leutner, their friend, the girl who had shared sleepovers and afternoons with them, and who had no awareness whatsoever of the role she had been assigned in a plan her friends had been quietly developing. On the morning of May 31, 2014, the three girls attended a birthday sleepover at Morgan Geyser's home, and the following day, Geyser and Weier suggested to Payton that the three of them go for a walk to a nearby park in Waukesha. Payton agreed, and the three girls walked together to David's Park, where Geyser produced a knife she had taken from her family's kitchen and attacked Payton, stabbing her 19 times while Weier stood nearby and encouraged her to continue. When it was over, Geyser and Weier left Payton lying in the park and walked away, telling her before they left that she needed to lie down and that someone would find her. Payton Leutner, bleeding severely from 19 separate wounds, did not lie down and wait. Instead, in an act of extraordinary physical and psychological resilience that her family later described with a kind of odd grief, she crawled out of the woods on her own and made her way to a path where a passing bicyclist discovered her and immediately called for help. She was transported to hospital in critical condition, and surgeons worked to address injuries that had come within a fraction of an inch of being fatal. One wound had narrowly missed a major artery. Payton survived. Geyser and Weier were apprehended that same day, located by law enforcement walking along a road several miles from the park carrying a backpack that contained the knife and other items. Both girls told investigators openly, and without apparent distress, that they had done what they did because Slender Man was real, and because they needed to prove their loyalty to him. The case was prosecuted in adult court, a decision that was challenged by defense attorneys but ultimately upheld, with the court determining that the nature of the charges and the need for extended mental health treatment beyond what the juvenile system could provide justified the adult court jurisdiction. Both girls were evaluated extensively by psychiatric professionals. Morgan Geyser was found to be suffering from early-onset schizophrenia, a diagnosis that fundamentally shaped how the court understood her culpability and her needs. In 2017, Geyser pleaded guilty to attempted first-degree intentional homicide and was sentenced in February 2018 to a maximum of 40 years in a psychiatric institution, the Winnebago Mental Health Institute in Wisconsin. Anissa Weier pleaded guilty to being a party to attempted second-degree intentional homicide and was found not guilty by reason of mental disease by a jury in September 2017, receiving a sentence of up to 25 years in a psychiatric institution in December of that year. Weier was granted conditional release in 2021 after spending approximately 4 years at Winnebago, released under supervision that would extend until she reached the age of 37. Geyser remained at Winnebago for a significantly longer period, with multiple petitions for release filed by her legal team over the years. In January 2025, 3 psychiatric professionals who had worked closely with Geyser testified to her readiness for supervised release, and in early 2025, a Waukesha County judge approved a conditional release plan that allowed Geyser to transfer to a supervised group home, with her treatment continuing under the supervision of medical professionals and with conditions of release that would remain in place for the duration of her commitment. Payton Leutner's family responded to news of Geyser's release by expressing the wish that she had served a longer sentence, a sentiment that her mother Stacy Leutner had articulated consistently since the beginning of the case. Payton herself has spoken publicly on limited occasions, including a statement reported in the media in which she described the lasting physical and psychological impact of what happened to her. She has continued to rebuild her life in the years since, though her mother has made clear that the trauma of May 31, 2014 has never fully left their family. The Slender Man stabbing, as the case came to be known, generated a national conversation about the relationship between children and internet-based content, about the speed with which fictional horror constructs can be absorbed and reinterpreted by young minds that are already struggling with psychological instability, and about the obligations of parents, educators, and platform creators in an environment where 12-year-old children have unrestricted access to content that was never designed with their psychological safety in mind. Payton Leutner walked into a park with 2 girls she considered her friends, and she walked out of the woods alone, wounded and afraid, because she refused to give up. That decision to keep moving when every physical instinct might have counseled otherwise is the detail that stays with everyone who has ever encountered her story. Number 5. Adrianne Reynolds, the new girl who never got a chance. Adrianne Lee Reynolds was born on September 12, 1988, in Kilgore, Texas, and spent her early years in the state where she was born before circumstances led her, at the age of 16, to leave Texas and move to East Moline, Illinois, to live with her grandfather and step-grandmother, Tony and Joan Reynolds. It was a significant transition. A new city, a new school, a new social environment, and Adrianne approached it the way many teenagers in that situation do, by trying to connect quickly with the people around her and find a place where she belonged. She enrolled at Black Hawk Area Vocational Center and almost immediately began spending time with 2 of her classmates, a 16-year-old girl named Sarah and Kolb and a 17-year-old boy named Corey Gregory, who were at that time involved in a romantic relationship with each other. To Adrianne, who was new to East Moline and still building her social footing, the friendship seemed like an opportunity, a way in, a connection, a sense of belonging in a place that was not yet fully familiar. She had only been in the area for approximately 2 months when she was invited to spend time with Kolb and Gregory, and she had no way of knowing that the dynamic between the 3 of them was already becoming a source of significant tension, particularly for Sarah Kolb. Prosecutors would later argue at trial that Kolb had grown deeply resentful of the attention that Adrianne was paying to Corey Gregory, interpreting it as a form of romantic competition and responding to that perceived threat in a way that escalated far beyond any reasonable response to the ordinary social friction of teenage life. On January 21, 2005, less than 2 months after Adrianne had arrived in East Moline, the 3 teenagers were together in Sarah Kolb's car, parked in the parking lot of a Taco Bell restaurant in Moline. What happened inside that car, according to the evidence presented at trial and the account that Corey Gregory eventually provided to investigators, was that an argument broke out, that the confrontation turned physical, and that Adrianne Reynolds was strangled with a belt while Kolb and Gregory held her down. She was 16 years old and had been in Illinois for approximately 60 days. In the immediate aftermath, Kolb and Gregory drove to a rural area and attempted to dispose of Adrianne's body, But the attempt did not go as planned, and the two of them subsequently recruited a third teenager, a classmate named Nathan Gadet, to assist them in more fully concealing the evidence of what they had done. Some of Adrianne's remains were ultimately left at the Black Hawk State Historic Site in Rock Island, concealed in a garbage bag, and it was there that portions of her body were eventually discovered by investigators. The investigation unfolded over the days that followed Adrianne's disappearance, with law enforcement piecing together the last known movements and social connections of a girl who had been in the area such a short time that the number of people who knew her well was still quite small. Kolb and Gregory were both identified as the last people to have seen Adrianne alive, and as investigators examined the physical evidence and began applying pressure to the social circle around the case, the story began to come apart. Corey Gregory ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges against him and cooperated with the prosecution, providing testimony that helped establish the sequence of events inside the car and the subsequent actions taken to conceal the crime. Sarah Kolb went to trial, and the first trial ended in a mistrial after a jury deadlocked 11-1 in favor of conviction. The case was retried in Dixon, Illinois, due to the extent of media coverage in the original venue, and in the retrial Kolb was found guilty of first-degree murder and concealment of a homicidal death. At sentencing, Rock Island County Circuit Judge James Terros described Kolb as a cold and callous person, stating plainly that he did not believe that was going to change, and sentenced her to 48 years for murder and 5 years for concealment, to be served consecutively, for a total of 53 years in prison. Corey Gregory was sentenced to 40 years for murder and 5 years for concealment, a total of 45 years. A third teen, Nathan Gadet, who assisted in the concealment of Adrianne's remains, was also charged in connection with the crime. Kolb appealed her sentence multiple times over the following years, arguing on various grounds including the constitutional implications of lengthy sentences for juvenile offenders, but each appeal was ultimately denied. As of the most recent available records, Sarah Kolb is serving her sentence at Logan Correctional Center and will not be eligible for parole until 2055, with a scheduled release date of 2058. Corey Gregory, who now goes by the name Harley Quinn, was resentenced in 2022 after a ruling by the Illinois Supreme Court that sentences of more than 40 years for juvenile offenders constitute de facto life sentences that are unconstitutional when imposed without consideration of juvenile factors, and received the same 45-year sentence following a new hearing. Adrianne Reynolds had been in East Moline for 60 days. She had moved to a new state to build a new chapter of her life, and she had done what anyone in that position would do. She had reached out to the people around her, tried to make friends, tried to belong. The family she left behind in Texas, and the Reynolds family in Illinois who had welcomed her, were left to carry the weight of a loss that arrived before anyone had even had the chance to fully understand who Adrianne was becoming. Number 6, Michelle Avila, the best friend who became a target. Michelle Yvette Avila, known to virtually everyone in her life by her nickname Missy, was born on February 8, 1968, and grew up in the Arleta neighborhood of Los Angeles, in the sun-drenched sprawl of the San Fernando Valley, where she attended San Fernando High School and built the kind of social life that came naturally to a girl who was, by all accounts, genuinely warm, physically striking, and comfortable in her own skin in a way that drew people toward her. She was small, 4 feet 10 inches tall and barely 97 pounds, with long auburn hair that fell to her waist and a personality that made her memorable to everyone she encountered. One of the most important friendships of her life had begun when she was just 8 years old, when she met a girl named Karen Severson, and the two of them had grown up alongside each other in the way of childhood friends who become so intertwined in each other's daily lives that the friendship itself starts to feel like a permanent feature of reality. Karen Severson, by contrast with Missy, was someone who struggled socially in ways that Missy's natural ease seemed to highlight rather than diminish. And as the two girls moved through their teenage years, the dynamic between them began to shift in ways that Missy may not have fully registered, but that Karen was feeling with increasing intensity. Missy was popular. She was pretty. She was attentive to boys and they were attentive to her. And as she grew older, she began spending more of her time in the social world of dating and parties and the broader peer landscape of high school, naturally spending somewhat less time with Karen in the process. This was not, by any reasonable interpretation, a betrayal. It was simply the ordinary drift that happens between childhood friends as they grow into different versions of themselves. But Karen Severson experienced it as a profound and humiliating abandonment, and the resentment she felt calcified over time into something she was apparently unable to process or set aside. She began spreading rumors about Missy within their shared social circle. Accusations about her behavior with boys that were both cruel in their specificity and damaging in the community where Missy lived. A second girl, Laura Doyle, had also developed grievances against Missy, centered on a belief that Missy had been involved with Laura's boyfriend, and in the toxic social atmosphere that Karen's rumor spreading had helped to create. The two of them found in each other a shared grievance that would eventually become something far more dangerous than gossip. On October 1, 1985, Missy told her mother that she was going out with her friend Laura Doyle. Doyle picked her up and the two drove out toward the Angeles National Forest, a vast expanse of wilderness north of Los Angeles that offered the kind of remote isolation that the events of that afternoon required. Approximately 4 hours after leaving with Laura, Doyle called Missy's mother and asked to speak with her daughter, then explained that she had dropped Missy off with a group of boys and that when she returned, both Missy and the boys were gone. It was a lie designed to create an alibi and to deflect suspicion, and it worked, at least initially, because Missy's mother had no reason to doubt it. 3 days later, hikers discovered Missy's body face down in a shallow creek in Big Tujunga Canyon in the Angeles National Forest. A 4-foot log had been placed across her back, and her long hair, which had been one of her most recognizable features, had been partially chopped off. Medical examiners determined that she had been drowned in the creek, which was only a few inches deep at the location where her body was found, meaning that the act required sustained physical effort and deliberate intention rather than being the result of an accident or a momentary loss of control. She was 17 years old. What happened next was one of the most remarkable performances of false grief in the history of the case. Karen Severson and Laura Doyle attended Missy's funeral and comforted her grieving mother, Adrianne Avila. Karen went further still. She moved into the Avila family home and became, as Irene would later describe to People magazine, like a daughter to her. She promised Irene she would find whoever had taken Missy from them. She stayed up nights talking with the grieving mother about her daughter. She participated in every effort to identify the killer, even suggesting possible suspects to investigators, all while knowing with absolute certainty that she herself was responsible for Missy's death. That performance was sustained for 3 years, 3 full years in which Karen Severson lived partially within the orbit of the family she had destroyed, maintaining the lie through a combination of nerve and calculation that investigators later found deeply disturbing when they finally understood the full picture. The break in the case came in 1988, when a girl named Eva Kairumbalo, who had been present in the forest that day, came forward to authorities and told the truth about what she had witnessed. Her account directed investigators to Karen Severson and Laura Doyle, and both women were subsequently arrested and charged with murder. They were tried in 1990, when both were 22 years old, approximately 5 years after the crime was committed. A Superior Court jury convicted both of them of second-degree murder, rejecting the prosecution's argument for a first-degree conviction on the grounds that the jury was not fully persuaded the killing had been planned in advance. Superior Court Judge Jack Tso sentenced each of them to 15 years to life in prison. Karen Severson was paroled in December 2011 after serving 21.5 years, and Laura Doyle was paroled in December 2012 after serving 22 years. The releases generated significant controversy, with Adrianne Avila, who had spent years fighting against their parole, publicly expressing her outrage and grief at the decisions. The controversy deepened when, after her release, Karen Severson began writing and publishing memoirs about the crime under a pen name, a development that prompted Missy's family to campaign for the adoption in California of legislation that would prevent convicted felons from profiting from accounts of their crimes. In statements promoting her writing, Severson portrayed herself as a reformed person and described the killing in ways that appeared to shift responsibility onto Missy herself, implying that Missy bore some accountability for the social tensions that led to her death, a framing that Adrianne Avila and those who had followed the case found deeply offensive and morally indefensible. The murder of Missy Avila is a case about the particular cruelty that can develop within long-term female friendships when jealousy and social resentment are left to grow unchecked and unaddressed, and about the extraordinary lengths to which people who have done terrible things will go to protect themselves from the consequences. Missy was 17 years old and weighed 97 pounds when she walked into the Angeles National Forest with someone she thought was her friend, and she never walked out. Number 7, Sarah Stern, the inheritance that made her a target. Sarah Stern was 19 years old when she disappeared from her home in Neptune City, New Jersey, on the night of December 2, 2016, and the circumstances of her vanishing were, from the very beginning, deeply ambiguous in ways that made the initial investigation difficult to navigate. Her car, an older Oldsmobile she had borrowed from her grandmother, was found abandoned near a bridge in Belmar overlooking the Shark River Inlet, and the positioning of the vehicle, along with the absence of any other immediate evidence, led investigators to consider the possibility that Sarah had taken her own life. It was a conclusion that her father Michael Stern refused to accept, and his refusal to accept it, sustained over the weeks and months that followed in the face of official uncertainty, proved ultimately to be correct in a way that made the truth, when it finally emerged, far more devastating than any accident or self-determined ending could have been. Sarah Stern had grown up in Neptune City, and one of the most significant friendships of her life, a friendship that stretched back to when she was approximately 6 years old, was with a boy named Liam McAtasney, who had been part of her social world for so long that the bond between them carried the particular weight and texture of something built over a shared childhood. She trusted him as someone who had always been there, as a figure from the permanent landscape of her past rather than someone she needed to evaluate or be cautious around, and that trust, as events would establish, was the precise quality that made her vulnerable to what he had been quietly planning. Sarah's mother had died of cancer in 2013, and the inheritance that followed her mother's death, money that had been kept in cash in a shoebox within the family's secondary home in Avon by the Sea, had become known to Liam McAtasney through a shared discovery that he and Sarah had made together, an accidental moment of transparency that he had filed away and that would later form the basis of the plan he developed. McAtasney believed, based on what he had seen, that Sarah was in possession of approximately $100,000. The actual amount in the shoebox was closer to $8,000, a significant discrepancy between what he thought he was going to take and what was actually there. But the belief in a larger sum was what drove the plan forward. McAtasney discussed his intentions with another former classmate named Anthony Curry, an amateur filmmaker who took the conversation seriously enough to record it, and he also enlisted his roommate and another former classmate, Preston Taylor, as an accomplice in the execution of the plan. Taylor testified at trial that the original idea had been to get Sarah intoxicated and steal the money while she was incapacitated, and that the decision to ensure she could not identify or report them afterward was made in the planning process as a calculated step rather than an impulsive one. On the night of December 2, 2016, McAtasney went to Sarah's home in Neptune City, and in the sequence of events that followed, Sarah Stern was strangled. McAtasney later described the act in the recorded conversation with Anthony Curry, telling Curry in graphic detail how he had done it and approximately how long it had taken, a disclosure that Curry found so disturbing that he went to law enforcement approximately a month later and cooperated with investigators in setting up a recorded meeting at which McAtasney made statements about the crime. After Sarah's death, McAtasney contacted Preston Taylor, and the two of them drove Sarah's body to the Route 35 bridge in Belmar and disposed of her over the side into the Shark River Inlet below. They then left her car at the bridge in a deliberate arrangement designed to suggest that she had ended her own life by jumping from the bridge, a staging that investigators initially found plausible enough to treat as a genuine possibility. Sarah's body was never recovered. The Shark River Inlet runs to the ocean, and despite searches conducted over the period following her disappearance, her remains were not found. Anthony Curry went to police in January 2017, approximately a month after the murder, and his decision to cooperate, including wearing a recording device during a meeting with McAtasney at which McAtasney spoke in explicit detail about what he had done, provided prosecutors with what they described as one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case. The secretly recorded video of McAtasney describing the killing was played for the jury during his trial, and its contents left very little room for the kind of reasonable doubt that a defense might otherwise attempt to cultivate. McAtasney was tried in February 2019. His attorney argued in closing statements that Christopher Snyder, not Paolilla, was responsible, a parallel to arguments in other cases, but the jury was not persuaded. After deliberations during which the jury asked to re-review the secretly recorded confession, McAtasney was convicted on all 7 counts against him, including first-degree murder, felony murder, robbery, conspiracy, desecration of human remains, tampering with evidence, and hindering apprehension. He was 21 years old at the time of his conviction. Monmouth County Superior Court Judge Richard English sentenced McAtasney to mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole, and also imposed an additional consecutive 10-year sentence for desecration of human remains, for a total sentence of life without parole plus 10 years. Preston Taylor, who had helped dispose of Sarah's body and helped stage the scene on the bridge, cooperated with the prosecution, and his testimony formed a significant part of the case against McAtasney. Michael Stern, Sarah's father, appeared at sentencing and read a victim impact statement in which he described his spirit as broken and spoke of the horrific dreams that had visited him since the night his daughter disappeared. He noted that his daughter was an angel who did not have a mean bone in her body, and that she had trusted completely the person who used that trust to end her life. Sarah Stern was 19 years old, a young woman at the beginning of her adult life, who had every reason to feel safe in the company of someone she had known since she was 6 years old. The money McAtasney actually found in the shoebox was $8,000. He gave up Sarah Stern's life for $8,000, having believed, incorrectly, that it would be $100,000. The mathematics of the case, the vast distance between what he thought he was taking and what was actually there, has become one of the details that people who follow the case return to again and again, because it captures something essential about the senselessness of what happened and about the particular tragedy of a life ended by someone who miscalculated both the value of what he was taking and the value of what he threw away. Number 8. Christine Paolilla and the Clear Lake Murders. Christine Marie Paolilla was born on March 31, 1986, and grew up in circumstances that those who later examined her life described as shaped by loss and instability from a very early age. Her father died in a construction accident when Christine was just 2 years old, and her grandparents, who had provided a measure of stability for the family, died shortly thereafter. Her mother Lori struggled with addiction, and when Christine was approximately 7 years old, she went to live with her remaining grandparents in the Houston area, an arrangement that provided shelter and basic care, but that did not insulate her from the emotional damage that had already accumulated in the first years of her life. Christine entered high school as a teenager who struggled significantly with her appearance and social confidence. She experienced a condition that caused her hair to fall out, which made her a target for the kind of adolescent cruelty that tends to find vulnerability wherever it exists, and she moved through her early high school years at Clear Lake High School in suburban Houston as someone who felt profoundly outside the social mainstream. The friendship she eventually developed with two of her classmates, Rachel Colorudis and Tiffany Rowell, was transformative in the way that such connections can be for a young person who has spent years feeling excluded. Rachel and Tiffany were among the more socially prominent students at Clear Lake, and they extended to Christine a kind of inclusion that she had not previously experienced, helping her with her appearance and introducing her into their social circle in ways that gave her a sense of belonging she found deeply meaningful. By the spring of 2003, Christine was sufficiently established within that social environment that the student body voted her the superlative title of Miss Irresistible, an accolade that, given where she had started at Clear Lake High School, represented a remarkable social transformation. In 2003, Christine began a romantic relationship with a 21-year-old man named Christopher Lee Snyder, and the people around her, including Rachel and Tiffany, noticed that the relationship was not a positive influence. Snyder had a criminal history and was known for substance use, and Christine's friends expressed concern about the effect he was having on her. As Christine became more deeply involved with Snyder, her relationship with her friends began to deteriorate, and the closeness that had previously existed between them eroded into something more strained and distant. On the afternoon of July 18, 2003, Christine Paolilla and Christopher Snyder drove to Tiffany Rowell's house in Clear Lake City. The stated purpose, according to accounts that Christine later provided, was to obtain drugs. The four people present at the house that afternoon were Tiffany Rowell, Rachel Colorudis, and two young men, Marcus Priscilla, who was Tiffany's boyfriend and was 19 years old, and his cousin Adalbert Sanchez, who was 21. What happened inside that house, the precise sequence of events, who did what and in what order, became a central question of the subsequent legal proceedings, with Christine maintaining that Snyder was the primary actor and that she had not intended for anyone to be harmed. What was not disputed was the outcome. All four people in the house that afternoon were shot and killed. Tiffany Rowell was 18. Rachel Colorudis was 18. Marcus Priscilla was 19. Adalbert Sanchez was 21. Two of the four were the girls who had befriended Christine when she had no one, who had helped her find a place in a social world that had previously excluded her, who had stood beside her at the moment the student body voted her Miss Irresistible. The house in Clear Lake City was quiet when police arrived. For young people were dead. There were no immediate witnesses, no surviving accounts of what had happened inside, and investigators were left to reconstruct the events from physical evidence alone. The case went cold for 3 years. Investigators pursued leads that led nowhere, and the community around Clear Lake High School was left with a grief and a bewilderment that had no immediate resolution. The break came in July 2006, when an anonymous tip directed Houston authorities to Christine Paolilla, who was by then living in San Antonio. She was arrested on July 19, 2006, 3 years and 1 day after the murders were committed. Christopher Snyder, upon learning that a warrant had been issued for his arrest, died by suicide in July 2006 before he could be apprehended, which meant that the full account of what had occurred inside the Rowell home on July 18, 2003, would never be established with complete certainty. Christine Paolilla went to trial in 2008. Her attorney argued that Snyder had been solely responsible for the shootings and that Christine was present but not a participant. But the prosecution presented evidence, including a recorded confession that Christine had made to a former friend, in which she described her own involvement in events that day. A Harris County jury convicted her in October 2008 of capital murder on all counts. Because she was 17 years old at the time of the murders, the death penalty was constitutionally unavailable as a sentence, and Christine Paolilla received an automatic life sentence. State District Judge Mark Kent Ellis presided over the sentencing, and Christine wept as a bailiff led her from the courtroom. Under Texas law, she must serve 40 years before she becomes eligible for parole, making her earliest possible parole date 2046. George Kalarutis, Rachel's father, spoke outside the courtroom after the verdict and said that he felt justice had been served and that the conviction was a first step toward closure for a family that had spent 5 years without answers. The families of all 4 victims had carried that absence of resolution through years of grief, and the conviction, while it could not restore what had been taken, at least provided the kind of legal accounting that allows people to move forward with some measure of finality. Number 9, Pedro Bravo and Christian Aguilar. Friends until jealousy intervened. Pedro Bravo and Christian Aguilar had grown up together, attending Doral Academy Charter School in Miami, Florida, where the two of them had built the kind of close friendship that develops over years of proximity and shared experience, and that tends to produce the assumption in both parties that the bond is strong enough to survive whatever ordinary tensions arise between two people who know each other well. They had both been part of the same social world, they had mutual friends and shared history, and one of the significant people in both their lives was a girl named Erica Fryman, who had been involved in a romantic relationship with Pedro Bravo during their time at Doral Academy. When that relationship ended in the spring of 2012, around the time the two young men were finishing high school, Pedro was affected by it in ways that he did not fully disclose to the people around him. That same summer, Erica began attending Santa Fe Community College in Gainesville, Florida, and she started a new romantic relationship with Christian Aguilar, who was a freshman at the University of Florida. The two schools were in the same city, and the geographic proximity meant that Erica and Christian's relationship developed in a place where Pedro, who had also changed his plans and enrolled at Santa Fe College in Gainesville rather than attending Florida International University as originally intended, was present. Investigators and prosecutors later argued that Pedro's decision to attend school in Gainesville rather than Miami was itself evidence of his unwillingness to let go of his feelings for Erica, and that the journal he kept during this period, a document that was discovered during the investigation and became one of the most significant pieces of evidence at trial, revealed the depth and instability of his obsession with reconnecting with her and with eliminating the relationship she had with his best friend. The journal contained extensive written planning, emotional processing that escalated into explicit contemplation of harm, and entries that described purchasing specific items that investigators later connected to the crime. Among those purchases, captured on store surveillance footage and confirmed by receipts, was a shovel, 2 different types of sleeping medication, a roll of duct tape, and a knife, items that prosecutors described in court as a deliberate assembly of materials for a planned act rather than a collection of unrelated purchases. Pedro had also used a mutual friend to arrange a meeting with Christian on September 20, 2012, framing the request around his own emotional difficulties and his stated feelings of depression over the romantic situation, creating a pretext that caused Christian, who had been avoiding Pedro's calls in the weeks before, to agree to meet with him and discuss what Pedro said he was going through. Christian Aguilar met with Pedro Bravo on September 20, 2012. That was the last day that anyone other than Pedro saw Christian alive. Christian Aguilar was 18 years old, a University of Florida freshman with a future that everyone around him had every reason to expect would be full and productive. He did not return from that meeting. His disappearance was reported by Erica Fryman and by Pedro Bravo himself, who presented himself to investigators as a concerned friend unsure what had happened. In the days that followed, as investigators examined the circumstances of Christian's disappearance and began to find the inconsistencies and contradictions in Pedro's account of the evening, a picture began to emerge that pointed unmistakably toward the person who had reported the disappearance and who was presenting himself as a grieving friend. The journal was discovered. The store receipts were located. Surveillance footage from 2 hardware stores confirmed the purchases. Investigators found that Pedro had used his iPhone's Siri feature on the night of the disappearance to search for information about a specific wooded location, a detail uncovered through digital forensics that placed his movements in a context that was inconsistent with his stated account of events. Christian's remains were eventually located in a wooded area, and the evidence gathered by the Gainesville Police Department built a case that was, by the time it reached trial, comprehensive in its documentary and physical detail. Pedro Bravo testified in his own defense at trial, acknowledging that he and Christian had argued on the night of September 20th and that Christian had been injured during that argument, but claiming that when he left Christian, his friend was still alive. Prosecutors argued that this account was inconsistent with the physical evidence and with the documented pattern of planning that the journal and purchase records established. After 3 hours and 15 minutes of deliberations, a jury in Alachua County convicted Pedro Bravo on August 15, 2014, on all 7 charges against him: first-degree murder, kidnapping, poisoning, improper transportation of human remains, giving false information to law enforcement in a missing persons case, tampering with evidence, and providing false reports. Circuit Court Judge James Calaw sentenced Bravo to natural life in prison with no possibility of parole. Pedro Bravo maintained his innocence in a prison interview conducted years later by ABC News, and his legal team made additional efforts in the years following his conviction to challenge the verdict and seek post-conviction relief, none of which succeeded. In March 2025, Pedro Bravo was found dead at the Okeechobee Correctional Institution in Florida, where he had been serving his life sentence. The Florida Department of Corrections confirmed his death and referred the matter to the district medical examiner for determination of cause. Christian Aguilar's father Carlos has spoken in subsequent media coverage about his son, describing a young man who was warm and socially engaged, who was beginning the phase of his life that his family had worked to make possible, and who was taken from them by someone he had trusted as a friend throughout his adolescence. The relationship between Pedro Bravo and Christian Aguilar had once been the kind of friendship that people point to when they describe what loyalty and closeness between young men can look like, and the fact that it ended the way it did has made the case one of the more discussed examples of how jealousy, when it is allowed to become consuming and is paired with a capacity for calculated action, can destroy not only the object of that jealousy but the person carrying it. Number 10. Denali Brehmer and Cynthia Hoffman, a friendship used as a weapon. Cynthia Marie Hoffman, known to her family and friends as CeeCee, was 19 years old in the spring of 2019, a young woman from Anchorage, Alaska, who had graduated from Service High School the previous year and who was working alongside her father and sisters on job sites, doing the practical work of someone figuring out the early chapters of adult life with the people she was closest to. Her father, Timothy Hoffman, described CeeCee in emotional terms at later court proceedings, noting that she had a learning disability that had made certain aspects of academic life more challenging for her, but that she had persevered and graduated, and that she approached the world with an openness and a trust in the people around her that reflected a genuinely generous spirit. One of the people CeeCee considered a close friend was an 18-year-old woman named Denali Dakota Sky Brehmer, also from Anchorage, and the bond between them was, from CeeCee's perspective, a genuine friendship built on shared time and mutual familiarity. What CeeCee did not know, and what no one in her life knew, was that Denali Brehmer had been engaged for some time in an online relationship with a man she believed to be a wealthy individual named Tyler. In reality, a 21-year-old named Darren Schillmiller who was living in his grandparents' basement in Indiana and who had constructed an elaborate false identity to attract and manipulate young women online. Schillmiller had presented himself to Brehmer as a millionaire, and in the context of that fabricated relationship, he had proposed something deeply disturbing. He told Brehmer that he would pay her $9 million if she would commit a murder, document it, and send him the photographs and videos as evidence. The precise dynamics of how Brehmer received this proposal, whether she was herself manipulated or whether she engaged with it willingly and strategically, became a subject of considerable discussion during the legal proceedings that followed, with the prosecutor and the court TV documentary that later covered the case both noting that the relationship between predator and participant was not straightforward, and that Brehmer herself had been, to a degree, running her own version of a deception. What is established by the court record is that Brehmer accepted the proposition and began planning how to fulfill it. She recruited a group of associates to assist her, including a 16-year-old named Caden McIntosh and a 19-year-old named Caleb Leland, offering them a share of the money she believed she would receive. She selected Cynthia Hoffman, her friend CeeCee, as the person whose life would be used to fulfill the arrangement. On June 2, 2019, Brehmer and McIntosh approached CeeCee and invited her to go on a hike near Thunderbird Falls, a trail in Chugiak, approximately 27 miles northeast of Anchorage. CeeCee accepted. She went with them because she trusted them, because the invitation was framed as a recreational outing between people who knew each other, and because nothing in her prior relationship with Denali Brehmer had given her any reason to question what was being proposed. The group arrived at the trail, and at a clearing near the banks of the Leutner River, the situation changed. CeeCee was bound at the hands, feet, and mouth with duct tape, and Caden McIntosh, using a gun that belonged to Brehmer, shot her once in the back of the head. Her body was then placed into the Leutner River. Throughout the act, Brehmer was sending photographs and videos to Shillmiller via Snapchat, documenting what was happening and transmitting that documentation in real time to the man in Indiana who had requested it. After the killing, the group destroyed some of CeeCee's personal belongings and sent a text message to her parents from her phone telling them that she had been dropped off at a park. When CeeCee did not come home, her father Timothy reported her missing, and police located her body along the Leutner River bank on June 4, 2019, 2 days after she had gone on what she had believed was a hike with a friend. The investigation moved with notable speed once phone records, digital communications, and Snapchat metadata began providing investigators with a picture of what had taken place and who was involved. Brehmer and her associates were taken into custody within days. Shillmiller was identified through the digital trail and charged from Indiana. An Anchorage grand jury indicted Brehmer on June 14, 2019, on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The case attracted national and international attention not only because of the nature of the crime but because it illustrated in stark terms the capacity of online relationships to be weaponized in ways that produce real-world harm of the most serious kind, and because it raised questions about the intersection of social media, financial manipulation, and the vulnerability of young people who form attachments in digital environments without the ability to verify the identity or intentions of the people they are communicating with. Denali Brehmer pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, and her sentencing hearing took place in February 2024. Prosecutor Patrick McKay Jr. addressed the court and argued that Brehmer bore primary responsibility for the outcome, stating that while she had not personally pulled the trigger, the murder would not have happened if not for her planning, recruitment, and direction of the others involved. The Anchorage Superior Court judge presiding over the case described the evidence he had been required to review as among the most difficult he had encountered in his time on the bench, and sentenced Denali Brehmer to 99 years in prison, the maximum available under Alaska law, with no credit for time served, stating that the sentence was intended in part as a deterrent to others. Caden McIntosh and Caleb Leland were also convicted in connection with the crime, with McIntosh and Leland convicted of second-degree murder. Darren Shillmiller, the Indiana man who had initiated and directed the entire scheme from a basement in Indiana, was charged with soliciting murder and faced federal charges related to other conduct connected to the case. Timothy Hoffman has spoken in the years since his daughter's death about CeeCee's life, consistently directing attention toward who she was. A young woman who worked hard, who loved her family, who trusted the people around her, rather than the circumstances of her death. CeeCee Hoffman was 19 years old, and she went on a hike with someone she considered her friend. She did not come home. The case that bears her name stands as one of the most disturbing illustrations of how completely the concept of friendship can be inverted, how the trust that makes human connection meaningful can be transformed by someone without conscience or restraint, into the most effective tool of harm imaginable.